Okay, so the important thing to know about populism from an American point of view, but also from the European point of view, because as an American, it seems to me that you Europeans never understand populism correctly, is that we invented it. That populism is a term which emerged in the 19th century, and it emerged in response to the changes in the American economy after the Civil War. So the Civil War, the great battle in American history between the North and the South, and depending on where you grew up in the United States, for example, I was born in Virginia, and so in the schools in the South, this was still described even in the 1960s as the War for Southern Independence. Whereas in the North, it was, the Civil War and a war to free the slaves. Now, it was not a war to free the slaves. It was not a war for Southern independence, in fact. But it is true that slavery was obviously the root cause of the Civil War. And it was a conflict essentially between two economies. There was a plantation economy in the South built on enslaved labor. And then there was an emerging industrial economy in the North and the Midwest built on unenslaved labor or free labor, although how free you can be if you're totally in debt is another question. But certainly to the white and immigrant workers in the North, the fact that they were not regarded as property was very important. And I put it that way because one of the questions that you have to ask yourself if you're a historian and you're looking at the Civil War is why so many Americans volunteered to fight. So, and this, sometimes I approach this question as someone who for a long time has lived part of the year in Vermont. So Vermont had a higher rate of participation in the Civil War than any other state. Vermont was the 14th state admitted to the Union, and it was the only state in which slavery has never been legal. So you can't say that Vermonters enlisted, as they did in greater numbers proportionally to their population than any other state, to free the slaves. But Vermonters enlisted because they believed that slavery was evil, and they also believed that the economics system that was built on slavery was a danger to them. It was a danger to them because the South had made it clear that they wanted to expand slavery into Western territories that were not yet part of the U.S. It was a danger to them because they felt that as free workers, they would never be able to compete with slave labor. So the Civil War was certainly always a conflict between free labor and enslaved labor. And in that sense, the Union coalition was a coalition between abolitionists who were always the minority. In other words, there were never a majority of Americans in favor of going to war to free the slaves. And that's one of the reasons why Lincoln did not announce the Emancipation Proclamation or the end of slavery as one of his war aims. It was a war to preserve the Union. Preserving the Union was seen as a good thing because it would create, a continental nation and empire, and it had a lot of, as they viewed it, uninhabited and available land that could be distributed and, people could settle. So there was a sense of opportunity. But it was not most Union soldiers did not enlist in the army because they were personally fighting to free slaves. Most of them had never met slaves. Those who had studied the institution, of course, were repelled by it, but most of them hadn't. So this coalition existed between what you might call artisans or independent workers in the North, craftspeople, yeoman farmers, people who were farming their own land, which happened all through the New England and Central Atlantic states, and then this rising industrial class, which is what you see in places like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Boston, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, where there are clothing factories, shoe factories. Now, a lot of these industrialists were enmeshed with the cotton economy. They depended on, if they were making wool, for example, not wool, if they were making cloth, they depended on cotton from the South. So the northern industrial class was divided, but there were also a large portion of them who wanted to expand industrially and did not want to compete with the products of slave labor or with a political class whose fortunes depended on a kind of a hereditary landed aristocracy. So the war ends, the Union is victorious, the Southern planting class are decimated. They're, first of all, the largest asset class in the United States in the 19th century, which is the class of assets of enslaved people, which at the time had a value of something like $3 billion, which is to say more than all the land in the country was worth, more than all the factories were worth, more than all the railroads were worth. This asset class had been liquidated by Abraham Lincoln when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And unlike, for example, England, where when they freed the slaves, they compensated slave owners, the Union did not compensate slave owners for freeing their slaves. So suddenly the South was left impoverished, devastated, and without a market for their crops and without people to cultivate their crops. At the same time, in the North, all these soldiers had fought a war and come back and expected, they expected prosperity to ensue. And instead what happened was the Gilded Age. Instead you had an age of consolidated fortunes of Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Carnegie, the Vanderbilts, people who had already made millions and then got even richer off the Civil War, and the society became even more unequal. And the Republican Party was their vehicle. So, urban workers went to war, but they did not enjoy any of the fruits of victory. And this was the basis for the populist movement. And originally, the populist movement was an agrarian movement because what happened all across the country, but what happened was, in a sense, was the extension of a Southern finance system to the rest of the country. And this was what was called furnishing. And what that meant is, if you were a farmer and you owned land, you would borrow against the value of your land to buy seed crops. Then you'd plant the seeds, and hopefully you have a good harvest. If you had a good harvest, you'd pay off your loan, and then you'd have a little bit left over. But the problem is that most of these furnishing merchants, the people who loaned you the money and who sold you the seeds, they had monopolies, and they arranged it so that farmers could almost never get out from under debt. So you had agricultural debts piling up and piling up and piling up. And eventually this prompted a revolt. And originally it was a sort of agricultural revolt of farmers in the Midwest, and also tenant farmers in the South. And the really interesting thing about the roots of populism is that this was originally a multiracial revolt. In other words, there was something called the Union of Colored Farmers, and they had 1 million members. And they were tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South who were trying to change this furnishing merchant system. And then you had farmers in the Midwest who were reliant on, for example, railroads, which would charge monopoly rates to take their crops to the market. There'd be grain elevators where their crops would be stored. They would often be owned by the same companies that owned the railroads. They would again charge monopoly rates to store the crops. So there was a kind of agrarian revolt. And in Ocala, Florida, in the 1880s, there was a meeting formed to try and do something about this. And then there was another meeting in 1892 in Omaha, Nebraska. And the interesting thing about the Omaha meeting was that you had this one group, the Farmers Alliance. These were the people who were trying to change the financial terms for farmers. And then you had the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor were a sort of proto-labor union in the United States. And they were trying to agitate for the 8-hour day. And they all came together in Omaha, and they came up with a list of demands called the Omaha Platform. And they decided to run a candidate for president on a party called the People's Party. And that is the origins of the populist movement in the United States. It's this confluence of agrarian rebels, as Hobsbawm would have called them, and urban workers, the urban working class, the urban proletariat. And they're coming together, and they're And then there was a third confluence in this movement, and that was that at the time the United States was on the gold standard. And of course, the gold standard was a way of keeping the currency restricted, keeping prices fixed and set to a fixed exchange rate, but it depended on how much gold was mined and how much gold was available. And the United States had gold, particularly after gold had been discovered in California, but they had a lot more silver. And so there was a movement to base the U.S. currency not just on gold, but on gold and silver. This was called bimetallism. And again, these people also came to Omaha, and the idea was to essentially loosen the currency supply and make it easier for people to get their hands on credit. So that was those were the material bases of this movement. But they had demands that included votes for women, an 8-hour day, an end to Jim Crow in the South, municipal power generation, and things like municipal banking so that farmers could get credit and they weren't relied on private banking for credit. So all of these came together and they ran a presidential candidate. As now is the case, then was still the case, that it's very difficult for a third party to break through the two-party duopoly. So they did not win. This was the election that McKinley won as president. But interestingly, their ideas survived and were adopted, so that if you look at the 1892 Omaha platform of the People's Party and you look at the 1912 platform of the Socialist Party, they're pretty much the same. In other words, the ideas come from populism. The vehicle changes from a populist movement to a socialist movement, and I would argue then feeds into the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. So there's a long durée of populism as an element in U.S. politics, and that's the part that I think Europeans miss. What I think Europeans see, which is also part of this history, is that when populism failed as an electoral movement in the 1890s, and in a sense, its high watermark was 1896, when William Jennings Bryan, who was a senator from Nebraska — Omaha is in Nebraska — he ran for president not as a populist, but as a Democrat. He ran on the Democratic Party platform. And he delivered this famous speech at the Democratic Convention called the Cross of Gold speech, that said that the hopes of the United States would not be crucified on a cross of gold, meaning the gold standard. He ran against the gold standard. But Bryan was a very interesting figure. He was definitely a populist, but he was also an evangelical Christian. He became famous in later life for being the prosecuting attorney during the Scopes trial in Tennessee in the 1910s, prosecuting a teacher who taught the theory of evolution. He was against the theory of evolution because he said it went against the Bible. So he's become a kind of caricature. But also, Bryan's evolution or devolution towards kind of religious fundamentalism tarred populism, so it became seen as a kind of movement of ignorance. At the same time, Bryan's running mate on the Populist Party in 1896 was a Georgia journalist called Tom Watson, who was an incredibly talented orator, a great rabble-rouser, but who became so embittered by the failure of the party that what Watson did is he essentially came to the conclusion that no Democrat in the South who ran on a platform of multiracial justice could win, that the only way you could win in the South is as a racist demagogue. So he reinvented himself as a racist demagogue and a virulent anti-Semite who, even 20 years later, when the Jewish factory owner Leo Frank was lynched meaning he was, hanged by a mob because he was unjustly accused of rape, Tom Watson was the main cheerleader for that mob. So this fact that Bryan moves towards religious fundamentalism, that Watson moves towards racism and anti-Semitism, have enabled, generations of those who disapproved of populism for their own political and economic reasons to tar it as a kind of know-nothing movement of ignorance, whereas in fact it was a genuinely deeply democratic movement that had a deeply progressive impact on American politics and which still exists as a thread in our politics, although I would say that that ever since Tom Watson turned right, there's always been a left populism in the United States and a right populism. And the problem is that, and I wrote this in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton was running on a deeply anti-populist platform. You know, she was basically calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. She was going to places like Pennsylvania and West Virginia and telling coal miners that if she got elected, a lot of them were going to be out of work because she was going to follow green environmental policies. You know, she wasn't saying, we're going to find new, good union jobs for you. She was basically saying, life is tough and you're going to have to pay the price of of ecological progress and environmental progress. And I said that if you close the door to populism on the left and the only door open is populism on the right, that a lot of people are going to walk through that door. And that's what happened in 2016. Okay, so as I've said, I think that Trump represents a populism of the right. And I think that is true. And we'll talk about the situation in the US in a minute. But I want to address your second question first, in a way, which is, does the understanding of populism differ on either side of the Atlantic? And I would say it differs in this way, that on the American side of the Atlantic, we understand that populism is a thing that we invented and that exists in, you know, good and bad forms or left and right forms, depending on how you want to see it. But it's a political tendency that has deep roots. And on your side of the Atlantic, I'm going to quote Bernard Cazeneuve, who wrote recently in Le Monde. He said, Le populisme est un dégagisme qui finira par mourir de son propre poison. Populism is a form of disengagement that will eventually die of its own poison. And I think that's, I mean, I have many examples of European misunderstandings of populism, but I thought that I would start with a former prime minister, since probably most of your viewers will have heard of him. I think this is quite common. It's quite common to see Europeans use populism as a term of abuse without any deep insight into what it means, except that they don't like it. And, you know, I think it is true that populism is an anti-elitist movement. It's always a revolt. You can caricature it, as people do, including some Americans, as it posits an authentic people and an inauthentic people, and it pits them against each other, and the inauthentic people are always in some sense demonized and dehumanized, whether they're immigrants or Muslim or Black or foreigners. And I think that you can certainly find examples of that on both sides of the Atlantic. That's true. But I also think that, and this is a part that I feel that Europeans miss, populism in its origins and to today arises from a movement. And the movement is often a broad movement. In America, as we talked about, it was originally a multiracial movement. And it is a movement against elites, but it's a cultural as well as a political movement. And I think if you don't see the cultural side of it, you don't understand it. And that's why there was a right-wing populist, Aaron Breitbart, who, you know, lent his name to Breitbart News, which is where Trump's ideologue Steve Bannon holds forth today. And Breitbart's deepest insight, and one I quote all the time to my staff, even though we're on the left, is that politics is downstream of culture. So if you don't understand that politics is downstream of culture, and you don't understand that people build a movement culture to give them the cultural ground to stand on and the legitimacy to revolt against the existing order, then you don't understand either how populism works or what it's doing. So I think that in the United States, since certainly the time of Lyndon Johnson, if not before, you had ordinary working people basically being told, that they were increasingly irrelevant to the country's fortunes. That American prosperity was not dependent on industrial or manufacturing jobs, that households who had achieved a middle-class lifestyle because, the breadwinner was a steel worker or an auto worker, had a good union job, making good money and benefits, and therefore, and thanks to Franklin Roosevelt's, Social Security and Lyndon Johnson's Medicare and Medicaid, people didn't have to worry that they were going to be impoverished in their old age. They could save up. They could send their kids to college. They could maybe, buy a second car or a boat. And this was all blue-collar workers. That vision of American prosperity and the American dream that prevailed from basically 1949 to 1965, that was deemed obsolete, but nobody told the people who'd benefited from it what they were going to do. And nobody seemed to have taken their fortunes and views into account. So they began to feel left out of politics, and they began to feel increasingly alienated. Now, that alienation cast about for various forms to express itself, from voting for Jimmy Carter to voting for Ronald Reagan to voting for Barack Obama, who ran as an outsider. You can't reduce populism to racism and account for the many people I've met who voted for Barack Obama twice and then voted for Donald Trump. I mean, these are people who feel that the Democratic Party has betrayed them, does not have their interests at heart, is controlled by the people whose funding it depends on. And again, this is a key part, is that crucially our elections have become tremendously expensive. There's no public finance in national elections. And so each party has become reliant on its own cadre of billionaires to fund it. Well, the billionaires who fund the Democrats are no more in favor of, redistribution and a vigorous welfare state or an expansive vision of the commons, all of which is what populism was built on, than the billionaires who fund the Republican Party. So what you have are two system parties, and then you had Trump, who was running as an anti-system candidate. And, Trump ran harder in a way against the Republican Party than he ever ran against the Democratic Party. He said much more abusive things about, George W. Bush's war in Iraq or about George Bush's brother Jeb than he ever said about Democrats. Now, that doesn't mean that I think he's, okay, or that any Democrat should vote for him. But I think it does help you to understand why so many Democrats did vote for him. And also so many swing voters who would not have identified themselves as Democrat, but who are definitely ready for an anti-system candidate. So I think what happened in the Trump administration is that you had an anti-system candidate winning. Now, where that leaves us now, because the system doesn't just, it's a system. It's not like one or two people. It doesn't fold up shop and go away. It tries to hold on to power. So you have a power struggle now, even within the Trump administration, between, for example, somebody like Peter Navarro, who's a profoundly anti-system, pro-tariff. I mean, I think he's also slightly mad, but he's in favor of a vision of the U.S. economy, which is an autarky, where we make for ourselves, sell to ourselves, buy from ourselves, and don't really rely on or trade with the rest of the world to any extent that matters. That would be a very sharp break with the past 50 or even 100 years of the U.S. economy. But he has Trump's ear, and not only that, he's in the Oval Office, so he's there almost every day. On the other hand, you have somebody like Elon Musk, who's in some ways a much more traditional international finance capital internationalist, except that he's also a military industrial contractor. SpaceX depends on U.S. government contracts. So what's odd is that somebody who is dependent on government contracts is assessing government contracts. That's an anomaly. But the fact that you have a wing of the Republican Party, which is pro-corporatist, pro-free trade, pro-internationalist, that's always been the case. What's new is that there's a anti-corporate wing of the Republican Party, and that's the Bannon-Vance wing. and it's not clear who's going to win, but they are, and maybe they will, in the first term, essentially what happened is that the populist swing was bought off with cultural politics. Trump said, I'm going to appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court. I'm going to try and suppress abortion. I'm going to give religion more privileges. And meanwhile, I'm going to give all my corporate supporters a huge tax cut. And that worked the first time. It kept his coalition together, except it didn't work well enough to get him reelected. And it's not clear that that strategy will succeed this time. He may have to choose between these two wings. And if he has to choose, that may not be good for the Republican Party's fortunes. Yes. Well, that is, as we say in America, the $64,000 question, meaning the big question. And honestly, how I answer that question depends on what time of day I get up and what the weather looks like outside, and whether my shirt is too tight. Because there are days when I think, oh, America is almost 250 years old and we've survived worse, and we'll survive this, and we fought a war to keep the country together. But there are days when I think this is the beginning of a civil war, and will shooting break out again? I don't know, but it does feel like, and I guess in a way that goes back to your first question, which is, to me, the roots of Trumpism are, in fact, in the decade after the U.S. Civil War, when there was an upsurge in strikes, industrial activity, worker organizing, political agitation. There was a movement for an 8-hour day by the Knights of Labor, one of the three main strands of the Populist Party. And when this happened, Karl Marx wrote that this movement for the 8-hour day was the first fruit of the Civil War. And what he meant was that the Civil War was fought between an industrial system and a plantation system, and that the industrial capitalist system won, and therefore, the inexorable, as he viewed it, march towards socialism and communism could proceed. Now, of course, it hasn't proved inexorable. I'm not a determinist in the way that Marx was. I think that, nothing is inexorable. But I do think that you had this period of Reconstruction where you had federal troops in the South to enforce equality under the law between blacks and whites. And you had, upsurge of industrial activity in the North. And then it all kind of came to an end. Came to an end in 1876 when the Democratic candidate for president, Samuel Tilden, got more votes than the Republican. He got more votes in the Electoral College, but they did a deal. And they basically said that that Hayes, the other candidate, could become president as long as he took federal troops out of the South. And so that was the end of Reconstruction. That was the beginning of Jim Crow. And of course, once you had Jim Crow in the South, that put an end to industrial agitating among white workers, because there was a impoverished class of black workers that could be used against them. And also it meant that there was never a truly united economy. You had a northern economy, which was a free labor economy based on, multiracial working class, and you had a southern economy, which was basically blacks were kept in peonage. And that both parts of the country, in a sense, profited from that, but they also paid the price for it. And the part of the price for that is that America never really developed a socialist movement. The great German writer Werner Sombart said that socialism in America drowned on shoals of roast beef. And I guess what he meant was that the northern workers were able to get such good contracts that they didn't push for socialism because they were getting enough of material benefits not to push for a socialist system. But still, you get this unequal country, its movement towards equality thwarted, and then you have periodic attempts to move forward. So you had the New Deal in the 1930s, a big attempt to move forward. But now what you have is massive inequality, and you have a president and a party who are deeply invested in an authoritarian system of government. So the question is, can that be thwarted through normal political channels? And if it can't, will the other side, i.e. my side, will we just accept this, or will we fight it by any means necessary? And, this is like the South during the civil rights era had this credo of massive, they called it massive resistance to civil rights, to anti-racist legislation. So are we, now that those who would thwart racial progress, thwart economic progress, now that they're in power, are we going to just go along with it, or are we going to really organize and oppose it? And if we organize and oppose it successfully through democratic means, will the other side acquiesce and relinquish power in the same way that the Democrats, for example, relinquished power in 2016 and in 2024? Or will they refuse to relinquish power as Donald Trump attempted to refuse in 2020? And if that happens, what will happen with the army? What will happen with the military? What will happen with civil society? These are all terrifying questions. More Americans died on one day at the Battle of Gettysburg than died in any month in any war that America was in subsequently. So civil war is terrifying and bloody and disastrous. And I'm certainly not saying I want it to happen, but I'm saying that I can see it as a possibility now in a way that never seemed real before. Because you always had the assumption that if your side lost electorally, you went away, you licked your wounds, you tried to recalibrate, and you came back in 4 years, and there'll be another chance. And, Trump has said, he said in 2024, vote for me this time and you'll never have to vote again. Well, not voting again isn't something that appeals to most Americans. So I think, it could be very scary.